The letters had been read. So many times the paper had gone soft, the creases permanent as scars. Violet Emery kept them in the inside pocket of her traveling coat, close to her ribs, where she could feel them with every breath. 7 months of correspondence with Arthur Penning of Larimer, Wyoming, a cattleman, he had said, with good land and a house that sat above a spring of sweet water that never ran dry, not even in the worst of July. It was that detail, the spring, that had decided her. She was 24 years old, and she had nothing left in Cincinnati but a sister-in-law who resented her presence and a gravestone with her husband's name cut into it. Marcus had been dead 18 months, taken by a fever that no amount of her nursing could slow. His family had been kind enough about it. They had given her until spring. She had placed an advertisement in the Western Gazette on a Thursday morning, her hands steady even if her heart wasn't. A widow of good character and some skill in nursing seeks correspondence with an honest man of the territories, with matrimony as the object. Arthur Penning had been the third reply. The first 2 she had set aside, one too flowery, one that mentioned his mother's house in a way that made her uneasy. But Arthur's letter was measured. He wrote of practical things, the size of his herd, the quality of the soil, the winters, which were hard. He did not promise her romance. He promised her a working life, a partnership, a place, and that spring, sweet water that never runs dry. She had written back, and then again. And 7 months later, she was on a stagecoach, crossing Wyoming territory in late September, watching the land flatten into something enormous and indifferent. And she was telling herself that fear was merely common sense, and that common sense was no reason to turn back. The stagecoach stop at Harrow Creek was a low building of unpainted timber with a hitching rail and a water trough. The driver called out the stop and handed her bag down without ceremony. Arthur Penning's last letter had been clear. He would be at Harrow Creek to meet the noon stage on the 22nd of September, a broad man in a brown coat, easy to spot. It was noon. The stagecoach pulled away. The dust settled. There was no broad man in a brown coat. Violet Emery sat on the bench beside the door of the stage stop and set her hands in her lap. She was good at this, the waiting, the keeping still while something inside her was working very hard to remain calm. The sun was high and warm but moving west, and as the afternoon wore on, the warmth went with it. By 3 o'clock the shadows were long. By 4, the sky to the east had gone the color of a bruise. The stage stop operator, a young man with a pimpled neck and the manner of someone who would rather not be involved, had already gone inside. A dog slept by the trough. A horse at the hitching rail flicked its ear at flies. She refused to consider the obvious conclusion. There were 100 reasons a man could be delayed. A horse, a fence, a sick animal, 100 reasons. By 5 o'clock, she had exhausted every one of them. The sound of a rider came from the north road, not from the direction of Larimer, which was south, but from the open plain. A single horse, moving at a walk. The rider pulled up short of the stage stop and looked at her. He was a large man, not young, with a hat that had seen hard weather, and coat the color of creek mud. He had a bedroll tied behind his saddle and the look of someone returning from a long trip rather than arriving for an appointment. He sat his horse for a moment. She expected him to go on. He didn't. He swung down, tied the horse to the rail with a single easy motion, and walked toward her. Up close, she could see that his face was deeply weathered, the lines around his eyes, and at the corners of his mouth, carved by years of squinting into sun and wind. He looked at her with a directness that was neither rude nor warm, simply honest. "Ma'am," his voice was low, unhurried. "Stage has been and gone." "I know," she said. Her own voice came out steadier than she felt. He looked at her bag, at the bench, at the empty road behind her. He did not ask who she was waiting for or why they hadn't come. He seemed to understand that the answers to those questions were not his business and not something she was ready to speak aloud. "Town's got one in," he said. "Clean place, Mrs. Taggart runs it." She looked down the road toward the scatter of buildings that made up Harrow Creek. The light was nearly gone. "Thank you," she said. "My name is Violet Emery." Brodie Holt. He reached past her and took her bag without making a production of it. "I can walk you." He did not offer her his arm. He simply picked up her bag and started walking, and she fell into step beside him. They walked the length of the main street in silence, past the general store and a saloon from which someone was playing a mouth harp badly, and stopped at a 2-story building with a lamp burning in the window and a modest sign. "Taggarts, rooms and board." A woman opened the door before they reached the porch, stout, gray-haired, with sharp eyes that assessed the situation in a single glance. "Mr. Holt, didn't expect you until Friday." "Passed through early," he said. "This lady needs a room, Mrs. Taggart." Mrs. Taggart's gaze moved to Violet, with the particular expression of a woman who has seen most of what the world has to offer and found it rarely surprising. "Of course she does. Come in, child. You look half frozen." Brodie Holt set her bag on the porch. Violet turned to thank him properly, to say that she would settle the cost of the room herself. But he had already spoken to Mrs. Taggart in a low voice, pressing something into her hand, and he stepped back and touched the brim of his hat. "Evening, ma'am," he said. And then he was gone, back into the dark and the wind, and Mrs. Taggart was ushering her inside toward a fire and a cup of something hot, and Violet sat down in a chair she had not asked for, and finally let the rigid composure she had maintained for the past 5 hours begin to come undone. She did not cry for long. Crying was a luxury she could not yet afford. But she sat in the chair until her hands stopped shaking, and then she went upstairs to the small, clean room Mrs. Taggart had given her, and she lay down on the narrow bed, with the letters still in her coat pocket. And she did not sleep for a very long time. The week passed in the particular way that limbo passes, slowly, and with the quality of something not quite real. She helped Mrs. Taggart in the kitchen, and with the mending and with the postal corner that occupied one end of the parlor, where Mrs. Taggart sorted the town's mail each afternoon with the concentration of a woman who understood that information was a form of power. In return, Mrs. Taggart asked no questions about Violet's circumstances, which Violet found to be the kindest possible gift. She saw Brodie Holt on Wednesday. He rode in for supplies, tied his horse in front of the general store, and came out 20 minutes later with 2 sacks of flour over one shoulder. He did not look toward Taggart's. He was a man who did not look at things he considered none of his business. She watched him from the upstairs window until he rounded the corner and was gone. He came back on Friday, as Mrs. Taggart had predicted. He had a gash on his right hand. Not serious, but deep and already stiffening. He had wrapped it himself in a piece of cloth that had not been particularly clean, and Mrs. Taggart, who noticed everything, noticed this. "Miss Emery," she called up the stairs. "Mr. Holt has hurt his hand. Weren't you telling me last evening that you did some nursing?" Violet came down. Brodie Holt was standing in the parlor with his hat in his good hand, looking faintly embarrassed. She cleaned the gash and bound it properly with linen from Mrs. Taggart's supply chest. He held his hand still and did not make a sound, though she could tell from the set of his jaw that it hurt. "Wire got me," he said, when she was finished, by way of explanation. "It needs to stay clean," she told him. Come back in 3 days and I'll change the dressing. He looked at his hand. He looked at her. All right, he said, as if she had suggested something mildly unusual but not unreasonable. He came back in 3 days, and then again. On his 4th visit, sitting in Mrs. Taggart's parlor with his hand unwrapped, and the afternoon light coming through the lace curtain, he said, not looking at her, but at the window, I've got a supply chest out at the ranch. Medicine and such. Been a mess since my wife passed. 4 years of a mess. Violet tied off the final bandage. What kind of a mess? The kind where I can't find what I'm looking for. He paused. Mrs. Taggart says you've got a head for organizing. She did. She always had. Her mother had called it her least romantic quality and her most useful one. I could come and look at it, she said. His ranch, the Holt place, Mrs. Taggart called it, was 6 miles out of town on a road that wound through sagebrush and then opened suddenly into a wide valley with a creek at its bottom and mountains above it, and a house of hewn timber set back from the water on higher ground. The house was plain and solid, and it had the particular quality of a place that had once been well kept and had since been maintained but not tended. There is a difference. He saw her notice it, and he did not apologize. The supply chest was in a room off the kitchen, a genuine disaster, though not a malicious one. 3 years' worth of patent medicines and bandage rolls and glass bottles of things she couldn't immediately identify, layered in without system, many of them unlabeled. She stood in front of it for a long moment. I can fix this, she said. I know, he said, and that was all. He gave her the small room off the kitchen for her work. There was a table and a window that looked out onto the side yard and a low shelf where she could organize her findings. Each morning she rode out from Mrs. Taggart's on the mare he had arranged for her use. He had done this without discussing it, simply told her the horse would be ready at the livery at 7. And each morning she arrived to find something on the corner of her table. The first morning it was a bundle of wild columbine tied with a twist of cord. The second morning, a handful of dried sage. The third, a small bunch of something she recognized after a moment as yarrow. Useful for bleeding, a medicinal plant she had used herself nursing Marcus through his last winter. He never mentioned it. She never mentioned it. She set each one in the windowsill and kept working. She came to know the sound of his days. The creak of the barn door at dawn. The particular way his boots struck the porch boards when he came in at midday for water. The long silence of the afternoon when he was out on the range, and then the slow return of those sounds as the light went amber, and the shadows stretched long across the yard. He was not an easy man to know. He communicated more through the economy of his movements than through speech. The way he would rest both hands on a fence rail when he was tired, the way he stood still and looked at the mountains when something weighed on him. She learned to read these things the way you learn to read weather. Gradually, and without realizing you've done it. She was aware that he watched her too. Not obtrusively, he was far too private for that, but she would look up from her work and catch the particular quality of the silence from the direction of the doorway and know he had been there a moment and moved on. She did not find it unsettling. It felt, if she was honest, like being carefully considered by someone who did not consider things carelessly. One afternoon, 3 weeks after she'd begun, he came in from the range early and set something on her table. It was a small leather case, no larger than her palm, stitched with careful precision, with a snap closure and a fold inside, sized exactly for her nursing scissors. She had mentioned, once, weeks ago and in passing, that she wished she had somewhere to keep them. That wasn't the bottom of her bag. She had not thought he'd heard. She looked up at him. He had already turned away, moving toward the kitchen for water. "Hide's good for keeping the rust off," he said, with his back to her. His ears had gone red. She opened the case and closed it and opened it again. The scissors fit perfectly. "It's very well made," she said. He didn't answer, but she heard him exhale, just slightly, as if something had been settled. She finished the cataloging in late October, 6 weeks after she'd begun. Everything labeled, organized, the expired medicine set aside, a written inventory in her clearest hand. She presented it to Brodie one evening before she rode back to town, standing at the kitchen table while he turned through the pages. He read carefully and slowly, the same way he did most things. "This is good work," he said. He looked up. "It's done." "Yes," she said. They stood looking at each other across the table in the fading light. The kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and something neither of them had the word for yet. "The barn could use the same treatment," he said, supply-wise. She felt something loosen in her chest. "I expect so," she said. And so she stayed. It was a Tuesday in early November, when Mrs. Taggart sorted the afternoon mail and went unusually quiet. Violet was at the parlor table with a mending basket, and she saw the older woman's expression shift. The lips pressing together, the small furrow between the brows that meant something significant. Mrs. Taggart said softly. She held an envelope toward the window, squinting at the return address. U.S. Marshal's Office, Cheyenne. She turned it over. It was a circular addressed to the community board. She opened it and read it, and when she set it down, she looked at Violet with an expression Violet had never seen on her face before. Careful and very sorry. "There's a notice here," Mrs. Taggart said, "about a man, a correspondent, went by several names across 3 territories, wrote to women placing matrimonial advertisements, took money from 2 of them as a property deposit." She paused. "One of the names he used was Arthur Penning, out of Larimer." The room was very quiet. Violet set down the shirt she was mending. She straightened the collar because her hands needed something to do. "There is no property in Larimer," Mrs. Taggart said, as gently as she knew how. "No cattle. The man worked odd jobs at a rail camp. The spring he wrote about, the marshal's office says it came from a dime novel. There were 7 women who corresponded with him. He was already in custody in Casper before any of them arrived." Violet looked at the window. Outside, the November sky was the color of pewter, and the cottonwoods along the street had gone bare. She thought about the line she had read until it blurred, "Sweet water that never runs dry." She thought about the trip from Cincinnati, the long miles of plains, the bench outside the stage stop as the dark came down. "Oh, you poor thing," Mrs. Taggart said, and there was nothing performative about it, only a plain recognition of a plain wrong. Violet breathed in, out. "Is he in custody?" she asked. Her voice was even. "Yes, awaiting trial in Cheyenne." She thought about what it would mean to write to the marshal, to be interviewed, to have her letters read by strangers, to be the story, the foolish widow who answered an advertisement and crossed the territory for a man who did not exist. To have that be the first thing people in Harrow Creek knew of her. She thought about the leather scissors case, about Yarrow in the windowsill. "Then it's finished," she said. "He's caught and it's finished." Mrs. Taggart looked at her steadily. "You don't want to make a statement. What restitution could I collect that would be worth the telling of it? He took nothing from me. I had nothing to take." She picked up the shirt and the needle. "Let the women in Casper have their justice. I have no need of it." Mrs. Taggart was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "You're a steadier woman than most, Miss Emery." She rode out to the Holt place the following morning. She had decided on the ride that she would tell him. Their arrangement had been built on his quiet charity, and he had assumed, she supposed, that she was simply a woman whose plans had fallen through. He did not know the whole of it. She owed him the truth, even if the telling cost her something. She found him replacing boards on the side of the barn, working with the steady efficiency of a man who has done the same job 100 times. He looked up when she came into the yard, and something in her face must have registered, because he set the hammer down on the fence rail and turned to face her with his full attention. Not impatient, just present. She told him plainly. The advertisement, the letters, Arthur Penning and the spring that had come from a dime novel, the marshal's circular, the arrest in Casper. She laid it all out in the yard between them, the whole of it, and she kept her voice flat and her eyes on the fence line, because looking at him directly was more than she could manage just then. When she finished, he was silent. The muscle in his jaw worked. He looked at the mountains, and the expression on his face was a controlled anger. Not his own anger, she understood, but one he was carrying on her behalf. That distinction mattered to her more than she would have expected. "I can write to the marshal in Cheyenne," he said, his voice low and careful. "Put your situation in the record. He'd be held to full account." "He's already being held to account," she said. "I don't need to be part of it." He looked at her. "I came west for a reason that turned out to be a lie," she said. "But the West was real. Harrow Creek is real. The work here is real." She paused. "I would rather build something forward than spend myself on what's behind." He was quiet for a long moment. The wind came down off the mountain and moved through the bare cottonwoods along the creek and settled again. "That's a practical way to look at it," he said at last. "I'm a practical woman." Something shifted in his expression then. Something quiet and certain, the way a thing settles when you finally understand what you were looking at all along. He looked at her the way he looked at the mountains, taking the full measure, finding it sufficient. That evening, instead of riding back to town, she stayed for supper. It had become a less unusual thing in recent weeks. They ate at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and talked, as they had begun to talk, about real things: the coming winter, the fence line, the north pasture. She told him about the mills in Cincinnati, the noise of them, the particular gray quality of the light in autumn. He told her about his parents, buried up on the slope above the creek, and about the winter he had come west alone at 22 with $40 and an idea about what a life could look like. After supper they sat on the porch in the cold, wrapped in their coats, watching the stars come out over the mountains. The silence between them had long ago stopped being awkward. It had become something else entirely. The silence of two people who had found they could be in a place together without needing to fill it. "I've been thinking," Brodie said. She waited. He was not a man who said that lightly. "About the house." He set both hands on his knees, a posture she had learned to recognize as him preparing himself for something direct. "It's a big house for one person, always has been. Since Marjorie passed, I've kept to the kitchen and one room and let the rest go." He paused. "Since you've been coming out here, it's been different. The whole place is different." The stars were very clear, the cold was clean and dry. "I'm not good at the saying of things," he said. "I know that about myself, but I see what's in front of me clearly enough when I take the trouble to look." He turned his head and met her eyes directly, the way he always did when he had something true to say. "You're the best thing that's come to this ranch since I built it. And I'd be a worse fool than the man who wrote you those letters if I let you ride back to Taggart's for good without asking you to stay?" Violet looked at the yard, at the dark shape of the barn, at the mountains black against the sky. She thought about the spring Arthur Penning had described, the one that had come from a dime novel and had never existed. Sweet water that never runs dry. "Not as the woman who sets my supply chest in order," Brodie said. "As my wife." The cold air was very still. Down by the creek a coyote called once and went quiet. "Brodie," she said, his name alone, without anything added to it. "I know it's not much by way of a speech," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "It is exactly enough," she said. He looked at her with something open in his face, the careful blankness he usually wore, replaced by an expression she had not seen there before. Unguarded and very simple. "Is that a yes?" "It is," she said. He exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding something for a long time. He reached over and took her hand, and his hand was large and calloused and warm, and he held hers the same way he did most things, with a steadiness that felt less like a gesture and more like a fact of the physical world. They were married in December at the Harrow Creek church, a small ceremony with Mrs. Taggart as her witness and 2 ranch hands as his, and the whole of the congregation watching with the quiet satisfaction of people who have seen something resolve correctly. She wore a gray dress she had made herself. Brodie wore his best coat and looked uncomfortable in it, and entirely certain of what he was doing. Outside the church, blinking in the winter sunlight, he took her hand again. Not as ceremony this time, but as habit already, because that is the kind of man he was. On the ride back to the ranch, her ranch now, she watched the valley open up before her, the creek glinting below, the house set on its rise of ground, the mountains white with the first hard snow of the season. "There's a spring," Brodie said, as they came into the yard. He nodded toward the north pasture. "Back behind the fence line, runs clear year-round. Sweetest water in the county." A pause. Should have mentioned it sooner, didn't think to. Violet looked at him for a moment. She thought about a line she had carried close to her ribs for 7 months. She thought about how a lie, truly believed, can lead a person down a road they never would have chosen to a place they never would have found. She thought about what it means to arrive somewhere you did not plan for and find that it fits the shape of you more perfectly than anything you imagined. "Show me in the spring," she said. He nodded, that one small motion that meant with him more than most men's paragraphs. "I will," he said. 4 years later, on an evening in late summer, the porch of the Holt place held more life than it had in a long time. Brodie sat in the chair, closest to the rail with a worn harness across his knees, working at a stiff buckle with the methodical patience of a man who has learned that most things yield to steadiness if you give them enough of it. At his feet, their daughter, Rose, 3 years old, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's obstinate chin, was arranging pebbles into a careful line with the concentrated seriousness of someone performing important work. Violet sat in the other chair with a small shirt in her lap, her needle catching the last of the evening light. The light at this hour came golden and long across the yard, the way it does in late summer in Wyoming when the air is clear and the season is just beginning to turn. From inside the house came the sound of their son, 2 years old, recently mobile, and devoted to testing the structural integrity of everything within his reach, making his determined way across the kitchen floor. Brodie glanced up. Rose was attempting to recruit the barn cat into her pebble project. The cat was declining. "Rose," he said, his voice the low, unhurried rumble she had come to know as thoroughly as weather. "Leave the cat alone, she's working." Rose examined the sleeping cat. She examined her father. "She's sleeping," she said. "She's thinking," Brodie said. "Looks the same." From inside came a clatter, and then that particular silence, which precedes a toddler's realization that he has done something worth reporting. Violet set her mending down and moved to rise. But Brodie was already on his feet, setting the harness on the rail and going inside before she could answer. She heard his voice, low and even, talking the boy down from whatever minor disaster he had managed. She sat back. She looked out past the corral, where the horses stood quiet in the heat, past the fence line, toward the north pasture, where the sweet spring ran clear and cold even now in the driest week of August. Brodie came back to the porch with the boy on his hip. He settled into his chair, and the boy immediately went for the hat, which was allowed briefly and then retrieved. Rose abandoned the cat and came to lean against her father's knee, and his hand came to rest on her head, automatic as breathing, sure as gravity. Violet picked up her mending. "You're smiling," Brodie said, without looking up. "I was thinking about something. Something good, I hope." She looked at him, the weathered face, the quiet hands, the children arranged around him, like the world arranging itself around something solid and warm. She thought about what she had wanted when she wrote that advertisement, and how small and particular that wanting seemed now, compared to the actual weight and breadth of what she had been given. "There was a letter once," she said, "that mentioned sweet water that never runs dry." He looked up then, a question in his eyes. "I found it," she said, "just not where I was looking." He was quiet for a moment. Then he set the harness down, reached over, and took her hand. His thumb moved across her knuckles in the slow, steady way that meant he understood exactly what she was saying and had nothing to add to it, because nothing needed to be added. The evening light held on the way it does in Wyoming in late summer, as if the day were reluctant to end. Rose fell asleep against her father's knee. The boy grew heavy in the crook of Brodie's arm and was eventually carried inside. The first stars appeared, sharp and certain, above the dark line of the mountains. The house behind them glowed with lamplight. It was not an empty house. It was full, in every way a house can be full. Not with anything that had been promised in a letter, but with everything that had been quietly, steadily, honestly built, one plain morning at a time.